All right, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce tonight's speaker. So Dr. Mike Ward has been investigating the decline of eastern whippoorwills in the Midwest and how we can help the species recover. Dr. Ward is originally from Jacksonville, Illinois, and received his PhD from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign in 2004. He currently is the Stuart L. and Nancy J. Levenick Chair in Sustainability in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences in the College of Agricultural, Consumer, and Environmental Sciences at the University of Illinois, and an ornithologist at the Illinois Natural History Survey. Dr. Ward conducts research on avian ecology and conservation throughout the Midwest, as well as in Texas, Florida, Mexico, Costa Rica, Colombia, and Cuba. He is a global leader in the use of automated telemetry to investigate the movements, migration, and behavior of birds. He has published over 100 peer-reviewed papers and has won multiple awards for his research. He is also on many technical committees, most of which are charged with informing management and policy to better conserve the environment. Dr. Ward studies the ecology and behavior of birds in the natural and modified ecosystems in order to inform conservation and management. That, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ward.
Yes. Thanks for having me. So the longer you stay on campus, the more titles I give you. So, and then you got to like write them all down. It gets very old. So, but yeah, thanks for having me up here. I get up here sometimes. Today worked out well. I was coming up from Champaign. I stopped by Joliet, pick up some samples, and then we were getting samples from the piping plover for their fecal samples to see what they're eating on Montrose. But I ran a little late, so I have a grad student getting that right now. So I'm happy to talk about a project we've been doing for several years now. Some of it's up around this part of the world, but you'll also see that we're traveling lots of places to try to understand what eastern whippoorwills are declining. And it's not just me. So I have several grad students. Right now, we have Grant Watinsky studying moths. Holly Coates is down in Missouri studying whippoorwills down there. TJ Benson, and then people at Ohio State, people in Missouri, kind of all working together to try to figure out why these birds are declining. And lots of people are contributing to this, right? So working lots of different states across borders. So yeah, lots of people are contributing. And so so I've been doing research for quite a while, and really I'm paid to teach, but also paid to produce publications. But ultimately, what we want to do is conservation, right? So Cornell came up a couple of years ago with this, billions of birds have been lost. A lot of these are aerial insectivores. A lot of these are migratory birds. A lot of you here do a great job monitoring birds, whether it's a bird conservation network or helping on the spring bird count, the Christmas bird count. All of these things are great. The sad thing about it is most of the time it's not great news, right? And so as bird watchers, we know as we go out there, we see fewer and fewer of certain species, right? Some species are fine, but fewer of some. And so as I get, got 10 years older in my career, focusing more on conservation and trying to what can we do to try to help the species. So several years ago, this whole whippoorwill project came out of this project on field sparrows. So this is my PhD student, Tony Sellis, who's now the director of the bird banding lab out of Patuxent. He was studying field sparrows because they're very odd. So they call in the middle of the night sometimes. And so he was tagging all the birds, find their nests. And it turns out it's all a big soap opera. The females call at night, just tell the males, I'm out here if you're interested. And if you go to their nest and test the genetics of a given nest of 4 eggs, one of those eggs won't be that female's social mate. It'll be the male a couple doors down. And usually she knows that male from previous years because they were neighbors. And so it's soap opera, right? And so we were putting out reporters at night because sometimes males at midnight will just sing and say, I'm up, right? And then because the females come to them, they don't go to the females, and the females have to go at night. So their partner doesn't see them leave. Because the partner sees them leave, they won't feed the young because they're not want to feed not the young that aren't theirs, right? So soap opera. So we had recorders out there at night, and this was in 2018, I think, 17 and 18. So 16 and 17. And there were so many whippoorwills calling at this place, we could barely hear the field birds. This is a place called Kennecut County Park. It's over by Danville, Illinois, not very far from Champaign. And it meets so many whippoorwills. Like this is a spectrogram, and just constantly in the background. So that 2016, 2017, a few years later, we worked over there on a project with saw-whet owls, and the local people were wanting to do some whippoorwill projects for kids, take them out so kids could hear whippoorwills. I'm like, it won't be a problem, just go out. So they went out and they heard none. All right, I'll come over there and help you. So I came over there because it's not very far from where I live. Couldn't find any. So then I'm like, I went out there a bunch. They're all gone. Then we realized they're all gone from the whole county. There's no more in Vermilion County. There's no more in Champaign County. There's no more in Piatt County. Where I grew up in Jacksonville, my dad has property out in the country. They're gone from where he lives. There was a bird watcher there, Colin Dobson, who found one little base spot in Morgan County, but pretty much gone there as well. So they went from being around to gone overnight. And we see declines, right? Right now we're in the midst of big declines of meadowlarks, like cuckoos, red-headed woodpeckers, some of that. But we go out and still see them. They just don't disappear. This bird has disappeared. So it's in the midst of a rapid decline. People remember these birds. I go out all over the place, even in Mexico, trying to find whippoorwills. And people know what whippoorwills are, right? We grew up in the country. You remember hearing whippoorwill. Maybe you have fond memories, or maybe they were keeping you up all night. But people remember that. There's lots of folklore. In fact, this picture on the side, this guy came out with this year. He's a scholar and author, and he used to study violence. So why people were violent. And he decided that was too negative. So now he studies whippoorwill and the folklores of whippoorwill. Very interesting guys. Some books are coming out. But everybody, indigenous cultures all over the place had folklore about whippoorwills. Some positive, some negative. Some where if you heard one, you're going to die. Some, if you hear one, you got to go plant corn, that kind of stuff. So people know about the species. And it's a species we might be able to recover, right? So I work a lot with different organizations about what we can do. And the average person doesn't know what a cerulean warbler is. They don't know about dickcissels. They don't know about, the average person knows a few birds. But whippoorwill is one that a lot of them know. And so we can use that to our advantage. And then with my first student that worked on this, Ian Sousa Cole, who's now with National Audubon, we can catch them. In fact, they're pretty easy to catch. So we went out, it's one of the most cryptic birds. So they're up, run around at night, right? Flying around at night. So we didn't know much about them. At the time, we knew they went to the tropics to winter, but there was no eBird records. There was no real records at all where they wintered at. Not very well studied. And a lot of us are starting to study them. In fact, Canada listed them as endangered. And this recently took them off because they found more. But there's a bunch of research in Canada, in the Northeast, like in Massachusetts, they're doing very poorly. Ohio, there's a new professor down in Kentucky we work with. So a lot of people are trying to figure out what's going on with this species. So our objectives were to examine what factors predict their occurrence in Illinois. So we still have some pretty good populations. Why are they there and why are they disappeared everywhere else? Are they reproducing? So a lot of times it's hard for a young bird to live in Illinois, right? Got lots of raccoons, got a lot of cars running around, we got a lot of pesticides. What's causing them to die? There's space and patterns of habitat use. The importance of moths, we'll talk about moths in a little bit, but this picture at the bottom, people that grew up, especially in rural Illinois, your window will be just covered in insects, right? You don't have that anymore, right? Unless you go to the Shawnee, not even all the Shawnee, just certain portions of the Shawnee. We'll talk about some pesticide work we're doing, landscape factors, our work in the wintering grounds, and then kind of ultimately what's going on. So back in 2019, 2020, we brought in this grad student, turned out to be great, Ian's work. He did point counts at these sites in Illinois. So these are sites where we thought their whippoorwills were at and sites they were lost from. And sampling insects is difficult. But we just bought a party lights, because not just birds, but insects respond to UV light, right? And then we would catch them, see what's going on. We look at where they were and why they occurred in certain areas. He found that they avoid urban areas. We still don't know exactly why they avoid urban areas. One interesting thing about it is moth populations crashing in urban areas. We have a world famous entomologist on our campus down in Champaign. Her name is May Barenbaum. Yeah, when I talk about famous, she's like Letterman kind of famous. And so we always talk to her about moths, and she's got interesting data showing that they're attracted to certain frequency wavelengths on urban areas of lights in your back porch, and they just smack into the bulb until they die. She's also got amazing data on pesticides, and she's encyclopedic. Though I always say to her, like, I'm interested in this moth. And she'll just say, Michael, how many birds are there in the world? So, what, there's 10,500 species of birds in the world. And we work with little noctuid moths, the little gray ones. There's 110,000 noctuid moths. We don't know anything about these moths. We don't even know, there's a bunch of moths right here that are migratory. I didn't even know that until we started this. They migrate up in the spring from Texas and Oklahoma. And that's a lot of what the whipwills are eating. So where you have whipwills is where you have moths, or vice versa, right? Our big area we have left is Sand Ridge State Forest down by Chautauqua, down in Mason County by Peoria. That has our best moth population. And we just sent a couple of people over there this year to catch some birds, and I think they caught 50 whipwills. Our other areas that have moths are up at Lost Mound, lots of insects, and they have lots of whipwills, right? I'll talk about some areas around here too in a second. We also know they like forest edge, but of course, if they liked forest edge, Illinois would be the place to be, right? Because we have lots of forest edge, but it's got to be forest edge with insects. Problem is, most of our forest edge is against ag, and whether it's BT corn or neonicotinoids or whatever, they just don't have moths. So Ian kind of figured out, well, we need moths to have whipwills, and they're disappearing in lots of areas. So then we wanted to figure out why. So we brought on another grad student, Sarah Stuart. She was here. She was, again, we get really good grad students down at U of I. She was here a very short period of time because she got headhunted, and now she's directing the research on replicated woodpeckers in South Carolina for South Carolina DNR. But she went out and found whippoorwill nests. They just lay 2 eggs on oak leaves out in the forest and tracked their little bitty young to see what was going on, tracked them the whole time. So looking at parental care, mobility, food availability, predation risk, estimating survival of the nests. Again, we did this work at the best sites we have in Illinois, which are Sand Ridge State Forest and Sand Prairie Scrub Oak, which is a nature preserve not very far away. So it might be a little biased because it is our best spot in Illinois. They're very weird birds, right? They're semi-precocial. So when they're born, they can kind of move, but not move very far. They're kind of a mix between, like a robin and something like a killdeer, right? So they can kind of move, but not move very well. Their egg period is 20 days, which is pretty long. The chick's 15 days, and don't fledge for 30 days. So most birds in Illinois are much faster than this because they want to get going as fast as they can, not get eaten. This lifestyle like this is more of a tropical bird. So tropical birds tend to have this longer, more investment from the parents. We knew, I'm not going to talk about statistics. We had lots of statistics. We did fancy information theoretic approach to understand what's going on. But the bottom line is we have several years of data. The probability, 51% for egg survival. And then for chick survival, like this little chick right here, about 54% survive. And we also very interesting, we caught the young and we would tag them. Most birds, when they leave the nest, they get as far away from each other as they can because the parents want them, they don't want all their eggs in one basket, both in the nest and out of the nest. We had parents hanging out with 2 young. The 2 young hanged out were together until they migrate, which is very odd. Like so close, they're huddling together at night for warmth, which is very, very odd for a bird. So we tracked a lot of birds, observed 12 birds after independence. Like, it's pretty hard to catch a moth if you don't know what you're doing. So seeing how they do in that situation. We had 4 instances right after independence where they died, and the transmitters all ended up in barred owl nests. It's just like anything else, just like kids, right? So you do stupid stuff. So once they get independence, it doesn't matter what taxa you study, they're just not very smart, right? And they make poor decisions. And so like we had one bird that was just like flying around below a barred owl nest, and it became barred owl food, right? But that's fine. I mean, that's the way it goes. Some birds are going to die. But their survival after independence is really high, 96%. So if you put it all together, you got the probability of the egg making it is about 50%. Probability of the chicken making it to where they can fly around is about 54%. And once they can fly around, the probability of making it till they can start migrating is 96%. You put that all together and you got a probability of about 27%, right? So, and they have clutches of 2. They only lay 2 eggs. So, probability, it's not great. They have to live for a pretty long time. So that's why I sent people over to Sandridge this year to catch, because we've been doing this since 2019. And we caught a bird that we tagged in 2019. We're doing research down in Ozarks, down by the Current River, and working with Ohio State on this. They're kind of done, but they tagged a bird that we caught this year. It was 8 years old. So it's probably the oldest whippoorwill ever caught. So they can live a long time, but they don't always live a long time. And we've had situations where we track birds with transmitters. We have an automated system to track them, and they're flying around and they just land and die, which is really odd for birds. We track a lot of birds, and birds die all the time, but they don't just land and fall over dead, right? And so, so something's going on with these whippoorwills. So again, we can catch these. So I should mention that you might wonder how we catch them. So there's a couple of different ways. One way is to put up a net, mist net, right? And then you play whippoorwill call, and then sometimes they get so mad they fly in. In fact, we're working with Chuck Wells widows now as well, and chucks and whips will get so mad they hit the net so hard they'll bounce out because they're just out of their mind mad. But they're not super smart. Ian found a few at Sand Ridge that he played. They like perches. Like they'll go to the exact same perch every night for a while. He found a dead stump they like to perch on, and he would just lay there until it landed there, and he'd reach his hand up and grab it. He got that for 3 years in a row. So not the smartest birds, and we can catch them, which is great because then we can tag them. And these little white dots are automated towers. We have a great engineering school at the University of Illinois, and we always guilt them, and they're making these new whiz-bang things, but they're not really helping the world. And so we guilt them into helping us make technology that we can track birds and try to do conservation. And so in this case, this is just as the birds move around. They're overlapping. So the whole purpose of this slide is not to see much of this, is that Sand Ridge has lots of birds and they try to be territorial, but they can't. They're on top of each other. They're just trying to eat as many moths as possible. And they're really in close proximity down there. And it's interesting because it's such an important place. So we decided, well, one thing we can do with the transmitters. So these are little bitty things you put on their back. They weigh less than a gram. Beep, beep, beep. They're like a little radio, right? And then we have antennas up there to pick them up. And so it's like a fit. We can use them kind of like a Fitbit on your phone, right? So every time the transmitter moves, the signal strength varies going to the receiver, just like every time you move, the little, the accelerometer in your phone or watch changes. So we go with activity. So in this slide on the side here, this is activity rates correlated with the moon. When we started this research, there was a guy in Kansas that worked with whippoorwills a long time ago that says they're really tied to the lunar cycle. And I was like, I don't believe that. Because if they're tied to the lunar cycle, kind of screwed, right? Because if you mess up, I mean, it's 29.5 day cycle, right? And so if you're trying to time your nests or trying to find all the food and it's cloudy for a few days, you're in bad shape. I was wrong. They time their cycle. They timed everything to the lunar cycle. In fact, you have to do surveys twice. We do surveys twice at each site, once during a new moon and once during a full moon, because it's night and day in terms of how much they vocalize. So I was just working on this a couple days ago. This data changed a smidgen, but we can get data on how active they are at dusk, dawn, night, and day. In this slide, you can even see the lunar cycle here. So this is a brighter nights. So they are what we call crepuscular. So these birds are super active at 8 minutes after sunset. I mean, you can just watch 8 minutes after sunset, they'll start calling and flying. And before the sun rises, they stop flying around at 12 minutes for some reason. And they're a little active during the day because predators are getting after them. But I was able to use data from other studies where we say dick thistles and field sparrows to look at how much of the day they're active, right? They're eating, defending territories, trying to find females, whatever they got to do, versus whippoorwills. And it's important, I can model this in the context of moon score, which is how bright the moon is. And I didn't know this, so I started this research either. You hear about like the giant moons and stuff, but it's real, right? So sometimes the moon is a little bit closer and it actually makes it quite a bit brighter. I mean, we're all used to, not having, we have lights, right? But if you go out to places that there's no artificial light, it's pretty obvious how the moon changes. And this can lead to big differences. So on the average night there, this is, I had to change this. It's now 2.1 hours after the new data was in. New moon, they're only active about 1.5 hours. Full moon, they can be active up to 3.5 hours. So because you might wonder why, it's because their eyesight is better than ours, but they can't see in the dark. They have a tapetum eye shine, right? So it reflects the light, but they can't see when it's dark outside, right? And so they find moths by sitting down low and backlighting them, the way their eyes are designed. They don't have really good resolution, but they have really good ability to look at motion. And so they look up to the moon, and as moths go by, they fly up and catch it, right? So if there's no moon, then they're just out of luck. And again, we know it's moths. So from this project started, people had said they eat a lot of beetles. But that's because in the old days, if you wanted to find out what birds ate, you got fecal samples or you made them puke. And then you gave the samples to undergrads and told them to go through this sample and figure out what's in there. Wasn't very much, right? Now we have genetic tools, right? So we can get a fecal sample, and about 85% of the whippoorwills we get, once they kind of calm down, we have a poop box, right? It's like a little shoe box we put them in. Let's let them chill for a second before we let them go. And they usually give us a fecal sample. And then with a fecal sample, we do what's called metabarcoding, where we just extract DNA and we just blast it through a bunch of primers to see what they're eating. That's what we're going to do with the piping plovers on Montrose, because Brad, we don't know what they're eating, right? There's some really cool research about it. Omega-3 fatty acids being super important for shorebirds, and they scrape those algae off sand, and that's where the fatty acids are. And so that's where we're going to sample these for. But for whippoorwills, it turns out if you look at what they're eating, like I mentioned before, it's almost all moths, small moths too. They will take like a big moth, like a sphinx moth or a Lunar moth, but those things are super rare. I mean, we get lots of Lunar moths in Missouri, but in Illinois, we don't get very many. I mean, hell, we hardly even get moths, really. But when we do get moths, they're the small ones. This is a couple years old. We continue to refine this, and we're working in different areas, seeing what they're eating. And then, because we want to know what the moths are, if they're migratory, not migratory, if they're crop pests. We know from the initial work, and it's kind of showing, this is a couple of years ago, but the new data is coming in showing the same thing. Armyworm moth is a big one. So armyworm moth is migratory. So they can't make it through the winter in Illinois, not even in southern Illinois. So they emerge down in Texas and Oklahoma in the spring, in March, and get blown up to Illinois in storms, fronts, push them up. And then they can have they can develop really fast. The green cloverworm moth, we had a big year last year for that. That is a local moth. It is a crop pest, but it doesn't really cause problems. In the old days, maybe it did, but not anymore. And then we have lots of other moths that we're looking at. And we keep on building this data set. Like in northern Wisconsin where we work, when we're up there, you guys probably know up there, it's darn cold, right? And there's only a few moths that can make it in May up there because it gets so cold. As we go down, we're working in Oaxaca and in Mexico right now. Moths that no one doesn't even know what they are, right? So it's hard to do the genetic sampling when there's not actually, the species not even described. But they got big honking moths that are probably fill up the gut of a whippoorwill. Interestingly, we catch a lot of tiger moths, that pretty moth up there, but we hardly ever, I think only once we've ever got it in a fecal sample. And May was there. The ornithologists are so dumb. So tiger moths are poisonous. And so if they do get in the mouth, the whippoorwills probably spit them out. Because I don't know how whippoorwill can differentiate between moths in the dark. It's Sand Ridge, this right here, these are called leonard sphinx moths, big body moths. That's where you have these big body moths with more calories. We have a professor on campus that studies how to make dog food and cat food out of insects to make it more environmentally sustainable than the way dog food's made these days. And she can tell us what the content is of insects. So we're sending insects over to her and trying to determine, is this the junk food of moths or is this like the T-bone steak of moths, right? So we can get calories, we can get fat content, we can get all these. because it might be there's moths around here, but they're like French fries, right? Whereas if you go to those Sphinx moths, that might be what they, because omega-3 fatty acids, more and more research shows that's what birds need to have to put on fat. Grant's doing some cool work on moth activity. And so when they come out, some moths are really tied to temperature. They're also tied to the lunar cycle. Some of them avoid full moons because they know they can get eaten. And so they only come out on dark moons. So it's a lot of work. He comes from the University of Wisconsin, which I don't hold against him. And he's studied insects up there. And so but he's always been a bird watcher. And so now he's kind of bringing together his bird interests and moth interests. And you should have him up to give a talk. I think he's going up to Lake Cook here. Maybe he was already at Lake Cook. But anyway, it'll be more on insects, but it's the moths. Yeah, I'm a bird watcher, so I watch birds, but I find myself more and more watching moths because there's some very interesting stuff. All right, some other interesting things about whippoorwills. So before we were around, right, you're gonna, like when we're up in Wisconsin, I'll talk about this in a second. There's quite a good assortment of whippoorwills in certain parts of Wisconsin. We were up there in early June and it's snowing, right? So what do these whippoorwills do? Well, whippoorwills and hummingbirds are unique and they can go into torpor. So torpor is the same as hibernation, right? They just reduce their their metabolism, and then their body temperature goes down, and that way they're not using energy. So if it's a cold night where there's no moon and you can't catch any insects, you don't want to sit there and burn energy. You go into torpor. And so we are doing research. This is a little bit complicated. This is some tough research where we put a temperature sensitive transmitter on a bird so that the transmitter beeps based on how warm or cold it is. And then we record that data and we can see what's going on. In this case, this bird was going along, it rained, it got cold, and then this is the body temperature of the bird. It went down for a while and it popped back up. Interestingly, just like us, right? If I told you to run down the stairs, our body temperature would go up or on our skin. You see the same thing with whippoorwills. So they're flying around, their temperature goes up, but they'll go way down. We typically think of torpor, like with bats do torpor, it's more down around 10 degrees Celsius. But this is really hard data to get. But we're collaborating with a guy in Oaxaca in Mexico on Mexican whippoorwills, which is they recently were split actually from eastern whippoorwills. They live way up in the mountains where it's darn cold in Mexico. And he just sent us the first data, and it looks like to me they're going to torpor as well, which is interesting. But we'll talk a little bit about why that would have made a lot of sense pre us coming here, but now it's rough on them. So what's going on is what we call the big squeeze. So, historically, I also should mention whippoorwills have a super big stomach for a bird. Their stomach can be 25% of their body. And so what they used to do is gorge themselves. And we still see this sometimes in Wisconsin and Missouri and at Sand Ridge, where you'll catch a whippoorwill and it feels like it's got a golf ball in its stomach. And it's actually gorged itself on emergence of moths. And so they would gorge themselves when they could. And then when there weren't any moths around, they go into torpor and just kind of chill. And they were only active for a very short period of time, right? So dusk and dawn, really, and on some nights. So really, they're only active for about 4 hours a day, whereas most birds are active about 6 or 7 hours a day. But that was a strategy because they don't have competition for moths at dusk and dawn. Well, as we destroy moth populations, they're in the big squeeze, right? They just can't find what they can do. And so I know Bob went to the Partners in Flight, and I've been talking to them about everyone's very worried about aerial insectivores. And my take on this is the first one to go is going to be whippoorwills because they can't change. They can't start foraging during the day because of the way their eye is. They can't forage at night when it's dark. And so their populations are crashing because there's no moths. And they have this strategy that worked good for years. Now it doesn't work so good. So you do sometimes see this is a nice night for whippoorwills. This was up by Eagle River up in northern Wisconsin. We had a trap out. That's some good eating right there for a whippoorwill. Most of the time, like where I live in Champaign, you'll get 30 June bugs and a half a dozen moths, right? Sand Ridge is pretty good. We'll talk about around here in a second. And so we need to get more of these bags is what I keep on stressing. I mean, how do we get moth populations back? And what I just mentioned, so the big squeeze, they're not active enough. Their activity associated with the lunar cycle, very crepuscular, need moths. The evolutionary strategy of torpor and big stomach And so this could be the tip of the iceberg with these birds, that they're just going to continue to crash. So we did this work, very alarming, but we only did it in Illinois, right? And we worked at one of the best spots in Illinois. And so Fish and Wildlife said, all right, we need to know what's going on everywhere else. And so we started what's called the Midwest Project. And we're still actually analyzing data because we got so much data. So we worked in Wisconsin, Missouri, Illinois, Ohio, and Michigan. We looked at moth abundance, landscape composition, soil type. So this are soil types now in the Midwest. All these reddish are sandy soils. It's going to be important to come back to. If you look at where our best aerial insectivores are in the Midwest, where whippoorwills are, it's all sandy soils. So this right here, that's San Rich State Park. This is Lost Mound. This is the Ozarks. Up here, you'll see in a second. Sandy soils. In fact, I'm trying to go after some big grants from the National Science Foundation right now to kind of get to the bottom of this, because it comes out any way we slice it. Only whippoorwills we have left are in sandy soil areas. Except there's a couple of, well, I'll show you some other stuff. There's a couple odd exceptions. So we're looking at occupancy. We use eBird. So you guys all, well, I don't know if you all do eBird, but people that do eBird can be really challenging for us to analyze for a lot of different reasons, but we're getting better at it. But we're able to use eBird records for whippoorwills, and along with the breeding bird atlases in different states, figure out where we wanted half our sites to be where there was whippoorwills, but they're gone, and half of them, they still have whippoorwills. Again, here's some of the sandier areas, and as you'll see in a second, these sandier areas are where our whippoorwills are at. We're still analyzing this data. We have so many insects. So we can, when we catch insects in those traps, we have to identify them down to like family and weigh them. And in Illinois, we don't get that many, but we got lots. And so I just got an update a couple days ago from Grant. We still got another 6 months of hiring 5 undergrads that work, not full-time because they're undergrads and I got some too, but they work a lot. And this has been going on for a while. But I want to show you some of the interesting stuff. This is the green areas are where we think according to eBird or other things, there should be maintaining their populations. And red is where they're lost. And you can see there was one that's just north of us, and there's one at the Illinois Beach State Park. So I'm going to go through the list of the top sites. Best site in the Midwest to see whippoorwills is right there, just south of Duluth. It's not what you would think, at least what I would think, right? It's a very vacation-y area, lots of lumber, lots of little lakes here with vacation homes there. It's not a big intact forest. It's like a working land. The next best is down in what's called Pioneer Forest, which I'll talk about in a second. This is a working forest where they lumber quite a bit. Another one, this is at Peck Ranch. Peck is where they're taking out lots of trees and they're reintroducing brown-headed nuthatches. I know if you've been down there, they brought them up from Arkansas to reintroduce them in Missouri, and they're kind of doing okay. Another one in Missouri or in Wisconsin. This is at Fort McCoy, which is a very sandy area. Lots of grasshopper sparrows, lots of other stuff that occurs there. A place, this is called the Barrens, a very sandy area, and up by Iron Mountain. A sandy area in Michigan, down the Ozarks, back up the UP again. And then I'm going to show you the areas where we never got any birds. Not going to be too surprising here, right? So you got this ag, if you know your geography, that's all ag land through there. But interesting, watch this. So we do get spots like at the boreal forest where we don't get any. There's spots where you think they should be, and they're just not there. In Michigan, in Wisconsin, every one of these spots we went to, we took a soil core and we sent it to Cornell, and Cornell can run it for about 100 different pesticides and send it back to us. So we didn't have any money from this because the feds don't have much money, and DNR much money. And so we had a little bit. So we ran about 30 of these cores, and it came back very disturbing. So up in the boreal forest at Chemonagan National Forest, in the middle of nowhere, you're getting ag chemicals. Where my dad lives, so he's bought that property before I was born. There's no ag around it. We would have fungicides in the middle of his property, which has got to be miles from the nearest ag field. TJ Vincent, the survey, is doing work on atrazine and dicamba in Illinois. Every single plant sample everywhere in Illinois he sampled. has atrazine in it. Dicamba, you might know, it's not a big issue here, but the volatilization, right? As you put dicamba on, it's too warm, it volatilizes, goes in the sky. So in the middle of the Shawnee, all the oak leaves will be gone because of the dicamba issues. So we have pesticides everywhere. So we did this. TJ went to DNR, they gave us some more money. So right now, all our samples are being run at Cornell. The problem, it's not really a problem, but the reality is other states are very worried about this as well. So Cornell's overwhelmed. So we're not going to get our, initially we're supposed to get our results in March. They got a hold of this in February and said, we're not getting them until November, which will probably end up being January, right? But it'd be very interesting to see how pesticide residues, like neonics. So you guys know neonics are 99% of all corn in Illinois is treated with neonics. And this is water soluble, goes into soil and goes up the plant and it kills insects, right? Any insect goes around there, it kills them. You know, people want to blame farmers, but it's not the farmers' fault. They can't even buy corn that's not neonic treated, right? In my opinion, the issue is ag business, right? And so neonics are outlawed in Europe and they're trying to outlaw them in Canada. And we had a meeting up there and the reality is Bayer, Monsanto, if they outlaw it, those have a new one, right? It's a money-making thing. And the crazy thing about the neonics from our crop science people in the same building is farmers pay more for the neonics, but they get better yield. But if they didn't pay more and they got less yield, it'd be the same money. The only difference is farmers make the same much money, but big ag makes more money because if they didn't use that, you know, it's all kind of in the wash, right? So we need to have better policy about this, which is something that's, you know, frustrating at best. So artificial light. So we're still working on this, but we see a couple sites that most sites that have lots of artificial light don't have whips, but there's a couple sites that actually are big outliers. And those are Illinois Beach State Park. So I assume a lot of you have been up there. Really nice spot, right? That's the last spot in Northeast Illinois you have whippoorwills. And there's actually quite a few there. And we actually found some nests there and they're doing pretty well. It is kind of sandy there, but it's a way different insect community because of caddisflies. So they're not, I don't think they're eating moths. When you put an insect trap out at night, you'll get a few moths, but you get these big honking, some people call them fish flies. You know, people like trout fish with them. I think they're feeding all on those up there. And that's why they're able to feed their young and do so well. We tried hard. Someone came out of this. We did get a couple fecal samples and they're still getting processed. And that'll be very interesting to see if those are all made up of these caddisflies. The other site is over by central Michigan. It's very odd. It's a very sandy area, but it's right between two cities. Lots of artificial light. And so we're going to do some more research there and check out why there's a decent population there. It's got to be insects there. And I wonder, it's kind of wet in that area. I wonder if they're also eating caddisflies. All right, so the birds aren't doing very well, but of course they could be declining because of where they spend their winter, right? And so we, over the last couple of years, I've made it a mission. So it's a tough life. In fact, I'm going to Mexico on Monday again to track birds. But we do work in multiple places in Mexico, in the Yucatan, in central Mexico, and in Oaxaca on the western side. And we were trying to find where these darn whippoorwills spent the winter. And so here I am with Roberto, my main colleague down in Oaxaca. He's got the spotlights on a potu. We haven't figured out how to catch them. Well, I think we can catch them, but I don't want to catch them just to catch them. Right? They're real, potus are big nocturnal birds. They're very weird. They really only forage in really dark times. And their eyes are huge compared to whippoorwills. So we're going to figure out some research on them. But we went out several years ago and deployed trackers on birds in Wisconsin, Illinois, Ohio, to see where they went. Turns out all the birds, no matter where in the Midwest, they all go to southern Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua. And so it's not just us, people in the East Coast, people in Canada, they're all going there. So if all the whippoorwills in Eastern North America all go to Chiapas, Oaxaca, Guatemala, that place should be littered with Eastern whippoorwills, right? So the first time we went down there, I'm like, we're going to find these. And, you know, it's fun to go out in the middle of the night in the jungle in Chiapas and see what you can find. We failed. So I'm like, I wouldn't give up. So we kept on going down there. We have great research going now with indigenous people. This is Zapotec, which, you know, is an indigenous tribe. This area is the Ejido, so it's the community land. They don't even believe that they're part. They don't care about Mexican permits. You got to get permits from them. I'm going along here, but the last time I was down there, they maybe go in front of the commissario and talk to them about our research. And then I was talking about migratory birds. There was 400 people there, and they all had questions. A lot of them were associated with our immigration policy for humans. And so I had to more redirect them to immigration policy for birds going across. But they're doing great work as well. So a lot of people are really doing great work down there on protecting these ejidos, which is their community lands, right? They're not, people live there and they can own a house, but the land itself is not theirs. It's part of the communities. So it's a lot more responsibility for the land. Here we are with TJ doing work. Got the buff collar nightjar, another nightjar is down there. We couldn't find whipwills, and I think it's all due to this guy. So if we play a whipwill call, this guy comes in, Prockies. The Prockies are big nightjars in the tropics, and they are super pissy. If you play the whipwill call, it flies right in the net. So I think what's going on is there's a lot of them down there. They don't make a sound, and they don't respond to whipwill calls. So the last time we were down there, we finally had success. There's a Prockie running around. Roberto saw some eye shine. We saw a tree, and we found the first record for eastern whippoorwills, even though we know they're there from tracking, right? But we actually found one and got a picture of it. Put it up on eBird, so that way there's actually one record there in the area. It sat there maybe 10 feet high. We had it surrounded by nets because I wanted to catch it to get a sample to see where it came from. It didn't care. You could blast it from whipwill calls, didn't do anything. The weird thing is, what's weird, we had a vampire bat come in, get caught in the net right below it. And I don't know if you guys probably never caught vampire bats. Big pain in the butt, right? They're trying to bite you. They're covered in, it's called bat bugs, which is like lice. They're really difficult things to handle, right? We're cussing, trying to get it out. Whipwill didn't care. I mean, it wasn't phased at all. The next day we went there again, put the nets right around here. It came in, saw the net, flew over it, landed in the exact same spot. So I know they're there, but we can't do research on them. But it turns out there's whipwills in Florida, in Central Florida. I had a friend down at Archibald that said there was some down there and that we should come down and catch them. I'm like, fine, I'll fly down there and see. We get there, it's a long day, flew into Sarasota, had to drive over to Archibald, which is kind of Central Florida. We get out, put up a net. He's like, just play it right here. Whatever. 2 of them flew in the net right there and we caught them. Right in the parking lot at Archibald. So we're doing more work down there now. Turns out they look like they use big oaks, live oaks, with a lot of Spanish moss. But no one's ever put a transponder on a whipwill in the breeding season that ever went to Florida. So we don't know where the birds in Florida breed at. So we put a bunch of tags out there last winter. So we're heading back down there again in January to catch them again. So lots of unknowns, lots of competition. I'll jump over some of this because I'm running a little late on coffee. Drink shade-grown coffee, essentially the moral of the story. Because shade-grown coffee is an area where we think the eastern whipwills are hanging out from the data we have. So as a professor on campus, I teach a lot of kids that are right around here, right? So I got 150 kids in my fish and wildlife class, and 120 are from Chicagoland area. And this last time I taught during the midterm, I had 2 people crying. And it wasn't because I'm a hard teacher, because midterm's easy. It's because they're all very concerned about the environment, right? They think it's all going to hell and we're all screwed, essentially. And so we have a choice about thinking negative or positive about the future. So I really strive to talk about, it's fine to be concerned, right? But at the same time, we got to be positive to figure out what we can do going forward. And a lot of the students don't really understand the real threats we have, right? They just hear a lot of stuff on the news about climate change and this and that. And so it's really our job to educate them. But one thing that's positive about is these sites where whipwills are at, these are not necessarily pristine forests. The ones up by Duluth, they're pretty hacked up, and that pioneer forest is kind of a mess. In fact, they cut out trees. It's a 60,000 acre private forest where they make money off oak trees. Holly's down there right now tracking these birds, and they love that. There's so many whipwills, you can't even count them. And I'm gonna skip over this. She's doing a lot of research about doing forest management. The other thing about this is the Shawnee National Forest right now, there's a lot of lawsuits keeping people from doing management down there, cutting down trees or doing burns because people think trees are good. The invasive species of trees down there are so thick, autumn olive, honeysuckle, that whipwills can't physically fly through the forest and catch moths. There's moths in there. There's no whips because it's so dense. We have to do forest management down there. And as a scientist, I feel it's my job. The people that are causing the problems and stopping this are well intentioned, right? We have to get the data to show what we're doing, and that's what Holly's doing right now. We catch them, tag them, and then she has situations like this. We're on this side of the road, they did not open it up. This side of the road, they let it go, right? That's honeysuckle, that's a mess. If there is moth on both sides, whippoorwills can't catch them on this side. It's just they can't physically move through there. Not just whippoorwills, great crested flycatchers, eastern wood peewees, they're all on the other side, right? Where it's more open. And I personally, we need more data, but I think there's more moths on that side because there's more light penetration and there's more flowers, right? They need flowers to get going. So we have this beautiful forest down the Current River, but the reality is we need management. So why is this pioneer place so good, and what can we do about it? Well, really it comes down to alcohol. So they're cutting the white oaks, and you guys might know this. There's a huge shortage of white oak staves. You got to put whiskey and bourbon and wine in white oak. You can't use any other oak because the barrels will leak. So they can get a huge profit on white oaks. So they cut out one white oak here, two white oaks here. They want it to be 20 to 40 years old. They have 60,000 acres, so they can cut out, whatever they want and leave it open for birds. And it supports the local economy. So in the county there, the main employer is barrel making, right? The main employer in Wisconsin is pulp mills, right? So it looks ugly. They go in there and they take out all the trees for pulp, but that's where all the birds are at, in these sandy areas, because you still need insects. And I think, I'm going to mention this, the sand, what we think is going on is it allows water to move through and it pulls the pesticides out, probably into our aquifers, but they're not there to kill the insects, right? And so, where I live in Champaign County, that clay loam soil catches all the pesticides. So all the things die because most of these moths, their instars are in the soil. So the sandy soil allows those things to wash out, right? Which we don't know that for sure. We're going to test that, but it's looking like that's what happens, right? So in these sandy soils, it's hard to do ag anyway, right? So they can produce oaks, they can do lumber, and it can be a win-win, right? The economy is doing fine. They can have vacationers, and at the same time, they can support whippoorwills. So again, logging is important. When you go there, we all like trees, but if you ever go there, it's really telling. You go from one area where there's no management because Missouri Department of Conservation owns it and they don't have money to do anything. You go to the area where they cut out trees and it's night and day. Oh, and for red oaks, they sell it as hardwood flooring, right? So if you get hardwood flooring, they're trying to make it environmentally friendly. Like we're trying to figure out a way to sell, and I just heard them try this as well, whippoorwill whiskey, right? So you're buying whiskey that's made out of barrels where the oaks are sustainably harvested from areas where they don't use pesticides and stuff. And red oak, they're trying to do the same thing, right? So if you go to a store and buy red oak, some of it's harvested in a way that's not good for birds, but others is, right? And so maybe most people don't care, but if some people do care, right? You only need a certain portion of the population to support these activities. So, still a lot to learn. It's likely a combination of factors, but we're kind of getting at it, right? We think they're dying, they're reproducing not great, but we need the habitat and we need the moths. We got to get rid of the ubiquitous nature of pesticides. It's going to be a policy issue. We have a couple policy people on campus that are very tight in DC. I mean, I don't know how they deal with stuff in DC, but they're out there trying to get stuff done on some of these pesticides. We need to manage our habitats, right? We can't just buy forests and not manage it. It goes to health. We need heterogeneity, right? We need areas for moths, for whips, for people, we need to have win-wins. Everybody wins in these situations. We're trying to be a social scientist, right? To educate people about what they can do. So I know I covered a lot and I talk fast, but I'm happy to answer any questions about this research or other research. Thanks.
All right, so thank you very much, Mike. Does anybody have any questions in here? We'll do the in-person questions first, and then I'll see if we have any questions on the chat. Any questions here?
I'll ask a question. You mentioned that there. I could say anecdotally, include Will County. And there there is a population there, and there's also just anecdotally, we're kind of work out of marginal farmlands. I want to go back, and those edges, those work talking about. And of course, that's all sandy soil along the river.
Yeah, I mean, Iroquois County also has lots of them, right? And that portion. There are some as sand block covered sands in Rockford area. Yeah, so there's a few. It wasn't that long ago where there was some in. I don't know how long the page was on, but. Oh wow! So as we do this research, we get a lot of people coming out of woodwork. Sometimes saying these that woodworks are gone. Others that say there's some around. The migration, right? So I've had in my yard seeing the migration. Where we get the back up here again, trying to see. I got a crazy idea about you can buy moth eggs, like lots of moth eggs, like 100,000 moth eggs, because companies rear them, test pesticides. They don't care, it sucks, right? So we've been buying 10,000 moth eggs at a time, putting them in buckets, and then putting neonate corn in there, some and not in the others, and seeing how many emerge. Yeah. Not surprising. If you put neonate corn, hardly any of them will emerge. We started to think about publishing that, but we're worried about lawsuits, so we need to do more work to actually so. But well, I want to take all these moth eggs and inoculate an area of sandy soil and see if we can like artificially increase moth populations. Problem is, some of these moths are theoretically harmless. Oh, I'm sorry, I should talk right here. Yeah. Yeah, so anyway, we got a lot of ideas. Any other questions? Yeah.
Are there any parallels in flying with the will in flying?
Nighthawks, yeah. So there is, because nighthawks eat a broader set of, they ask questions about nighthawks and whippoorwills and why they're both declining. Nighthawks aren't declining as fast, but they eat a broader set of insects. So they probably aren't as reliant on moths, but because they nest on top of buildings, there's some research, not around here, that suggests that eggs get too hot up there and they don't hatch. Because if you look at nighthawks in Illinois, they're primarily in urban areas, except for Ross Mound and a couple very unique situations. But there are people doing really cool research on nighthawks. We're not doing research because they're so darn hard to catch. But out west, you can catch them where there's not much rain, because they have to, first thing when they get up in the evenings, they go drink. And they put nets across ponds or creeks and they catch them as they drink. But around here, there's just so many places for them to get water that we can't catch them. It's all about catching birds, yeah.
Other parts of the country. You're talking about Midwest.
Yeah, so as you go to the, they fall out in Kansas and then you start getting poor wills, which is another crazy bird we want to study because it goes in torpor all the time. And then we're working with Smithsonian Institute on a couple different projects, and they're working in Virginia. We have colleagues. They're from Kansas to the Atlantic coast. They go down to mid-Georgia, and they go up to Canada. And so everybody's very concerned. So we're doing a really, well, I think we're doing a good job of coordinating our efforts. Right now, we're trying to figure out a new way of sampling moths, so not everybody has to hire all these undergrads. We're taking pictures using AI to identify the moths as opposed to killing the moths, because we didn't want to kill them anyway. We had no other way. And now we're going to allow them to take pictures, essentially.
Can you measure the moths? Are you measuring bio?
Yeah. Yeah, biomass. And then now that we have the interject, so some things are fat, but they're not have the right kind of fat, right? So now we're getting the data back on the what's inside. So there's like tomato moths, big chunky moths. I mean, that's like a steak, right? And then you got these little, you got to eat a lot of little bitty moths to kind of get it going. And we get a lot of interesting bycatch, like they eat, they're just flying around with their mouth open, right? So they'll get mosquitoes. We have some research on chuckwell's widows, you guys might find interesting. So a person was doing research in Florida and found 6 chuckwell widows dead because they're eating migratory birds at night and they get caught in their esophagus and they would die. Like one of them had a northern water thrush, some had magnolia warblers, some had redstarts. So we're catching chuckwell's widows down in Texas at Fort Cavazos and getting fecal samples to see if, because chucks are big, big birds. They got to be eating a lot. And we're already getting really cool data about how they forage differently, but I think they're trying to pick off migratory birds. because they go really high too. Whippoorwills don't get very high. And I don't know if you ever, I mean, there's not chucks around here, but that's a very weird bird we know nothing about. Any questions? Any questions on? Oh, hard to hear. Well, sorry about that. Yeah. All right. Well, anyway, I'm easy to contact. So if people have more questions, you can just Google me and it'll pop up. And feel free to ask me any questions. So. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, so that is all we have tonight. I just wanted to make one shout out. I was told that unfortunately, Jean and Bob, this is going to be your last meeting because you're moving. So, well, thank you very much for coming and being involved. All right, well, if there's nothing else, we're going to go ahead and adjourn for the evening. So thank you very much for coming.